Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We have so far looked at concerns of understanding organizations, looked at ways of organizing engineering business and systems. We have considered the structure and process issues in organizations, and of course, we have talked of the design concerns. We are going to conclude the first module by talking of the manner in which organizations would actually function, and this has been captioned appropriately as operating organizations. I would like to present to you a statement which reads the following: the system continually has to make this choice. What is the choice? It is as elaborated in the subsequent lines. It can either continue to exploit a known process and make it more productive, or it can explore a new process with the risk of the possibility of being less efficient for a while. Meaning thereby that when you are operating organizations, at any point of time you have got two options. One is work with the existing system and improve it. Which means building upon your experience, your feedback, your evaluation, and then going forward. The second is it can explore a new process with the risk of the possibility of being less efficient for a while. Now, the possibility of reduced efficiency if you try a new system is inherent, but it remains a possibility. Therefore, the first submission I wish to make to you is to accept that risk management really begins with the exercise of choices on a very simple concern. Are we going to work the organization as it has always worked and keep incrementally improving it, or are we going to work the organization with a complete shift in paradigm and approach and see where that takes us? These are seminal concerns in operating organizations, and to my mind these are appropriate choices which need to be considered, even though it raises concerns of risk management. The perspective therefore, in operating organizations is essentially one of classification of the activities in operating organizations. And what are the activities which are involved in operating organizations? Because that word operating may not make same sense to everyone. It looks at decision making, moves on to planning, moves on to organization design and structuring, moves on to staffing, moves on to directing, motivating, communicating, and also to controlling, all of which are totally different, but equally significant as a process within an organization. So, all these processes help to operate organizations. Therefore, the perspective which we are talking of in this context is a holistic perspective. It is a perspective which requires considered thought, and the thought that we will give is under three heads: planning and decision making in organizations, organization design and workflow, communication and information flow. Under these three heads, we are going to look at the various dimensions of operating organizations and position ourselves in a knowledgeable manner, so that the choices can be wisely exercised. First, the planning and the decision making process. What does planning mean? As we all know, planning is the most basic function of management, being concerned with the conscious determination of the courses of action required to achieve a predetermined objective. So, to put it simply, all management is goal driven, objective driven. Planning is the basic function which concerns itself with a conscious choice of the course of action required to achieve those objectives. Planning also has its parallel activity of decision making, because no planning would take place unless there was adequate decision making, which put in a planning frame requires to decide in advance what is to be done, and that is why what makes it planning. You decide in advance what is to be done, when it is to be done, by whom it is to be done, and how it is to be done. So, the key questions are what, when, whom and how. These are difficult questions to answer, but nobody ever suggested that management was an easy choice. We will reflect upon these concerns, and that would be how we will be looking at the question of operating organizations. The planning process crystallizes the opportunity or the problem. To crystallize the opportunity or the problem, the planning process has to secure and analyze the necessary information. So, everything in the planning process has to be data based, and this is an important prerequisite of the entire planning activity or operating organizations. Do you have the requisite facts at hand? Once you have the facts at hand, then you establish the planning premises, and once the planning premises are established, then you analyze the constraints. Ascertaining of the alternative courses of action is an important precursor activity, because alternative courses of action would require an evaluation of the options available, how much of it is practicable and how much of it, really speaking, is a possibility, but certainly not a probability. The putting together of the data, clarity on premises and constraints, and generation of the options would, it is expected, lead to the selection of the optimum plan. Selection of the optimum plan would lead to determining of the derivative plan, and then gets the time factor in, and the time factor requires fixing timings of the introduction of the entire process and arranging future evaluation of effectiveness of the plan. The point to be made here and to be noted is that truly speaking, evaluation of effectiveness begins with the process of setting up of the plans themselves, and that is how we operate organizations. We will be on course of time also looking at decision making, but planning is second only to setting objectives, and then decision making follows. There are different types of plans. Plans can be classified on time dimension. They often are. Short term, that is plans extending generally up to 1 year. Then there are the long term plans for more than a year. There are people who put between the short term and the long term what is called the medium term. There is nothing sacrosanct about these figures. It is not as if 1 year alone can be short term. There are industries where they would look at 6 months as short term or 2 years as short term. It has to do with the incubation time the plan would need. Similarly, the definition of long term can vary from more than a year to more than 3 years to more than 5 years, or indeed up to 5 years or up to 3 years, and somewhere the cusp between the short term and the long term would be termed as the medium term. Classifications based on functions would require production planning, marketing planning, sales planning, and the important phrase here is so on. Because 3 types of plans have been listed, it does not mean that that has exhausted the full potential of the plans. You can have a financial plan, you can have a human resources plan, you can have a plan with reference to just about any function. In fact, it may be a good idea to have as many plans as are critical functions of an organization. Another way of classifying is dividing them into objectives, goals, strategies and tactics, standards, budgets, policies, procedures, programs, rules, methods. I have given to you on the screen roughly a bouquet of captions which can be utilized for classifying the plans and subdividing them into operational norms. The significant factor will be that of trying to understand how that organization works and how it is to operate. I would now like to move over to decision making, and the definition of decision making is obviously rooted in exercising choices, but these have to be rational choices, these have to be conscious choices, and these cannot be choices at random. Decision making is the cognitive process leading to the selection of a course of action amongst alternatives, is the more considered way of explaining it. Every decision making process produces a final choice. It can be an action or an opinion. Now, this is important. A decision making can also be an opinion if it is not held by a stakeholder of the actual decision making, because the tricky part is, whereas the results of a decision may affect a large number of people, it is very rarely that all those stakeholders come from all the affected groups of the decision. Now, in an ideal model, all affected by a decision would be considered stakeholders. But in real life operational situation, it is not so common to find every single class of stakeholder becoming a participant in the decision making process. Very often the decision is carried out by an individual or by a group or by a designated authority or by a designated body, institution, but then the bridge between the ideal model and the operational model lies in recognizing that the decision maker will hopefully have taken into account the views of all the stakeholders through a consultative process, which brings us around to a very critical component of decision making, that is the processes of consultation. Every decision making process produces either an opinion or a final choice. It begins when we need to do something, but we do not always know that we need to do something. Therefore, the knowledge that a decision is due is itself the first critical step. Therefore, decision making is a reasoning process which can be rational or it can be at times irrational and can be based on explicit assumptions or tacit assumptions. The nature of decision making being what it is in organizations, very often there are tacit assumptions made on people's nature, made on people's reaction, made on people's approach, which are as likely to be right as wrong, but they do affect decision making. The explicit choice assumptions are more easy to list and more easy to accept, but the challenge of the situation is many decision makers are guided by a tacit assumption of the results of the outcome, but in operational terms they never accept that these considerations affected the decision. To decide therefore, the means of how far you go and how far you do not in the practical content is called coming to a conclusion. When you say you have come to a conclusion, then you have put a cutoff on how long you will agonize, how long you would consider and how long you would think about a situation, and that is the way decision is made. There is a decision making process, and the decision making process has three aspects, all three of it in a time sequence. Past, in which the problem was developed and information collected. Present, where the alternatives have to be evaluated and selected. Future, where decision will be carried. Now, if the decision making touches the past, then in management theory we link up decision making with what is called longitudinal thinking, which is basically distilling the past for its impact in the processes of the present. Then there is the present, which needs evaluation and some selection, and finally, the future, where decisions are carried out. The steps to it are the following, and let me elaborate them for you, and then I will try to explain it. Define and crystallize the problem. Secure and analyze the pertinent facts. Develop alternative solutions or courses of action. decide upon the best solution or the optimum course of action, convert the decision into effective action. A fair template which has nothing much to do with the explanation of the process, other than to establish that the whole thing is scientific. How do you define and crystallize the problem? You define and crystallize the problem by structuring it. In fact, there is a precursor activity even to structuring it. How do you know there is a problem? How do you know that something needs to be done? Now, that is a very important step in decision making. When certain goals are not being met, then you know that a decision is in order. So, put it very simply, a decision is required when certain goals are not being met. 2. A decision may be required when there are certain unwanted symptoms. In either of the two cases, the situation has to be captured, analyzed and structured. After you have recognized the situation, after you have analyzed the situation, and after you have structured the situation, you are in a position to define and crystallizing the problem. Therefore, you can clearly see that the process of defining and crystallizing the problem is itself really half the battle. You can't solve a problem unless you recognize there is a problem. Even after you recognize the problem, you can't sort the problem unless you believe that something needs to be done about it. And after you have recognized the problem and you believe that something needs to be done about it, the fact still remains. The problem has to be understood. The feeling that there is a problem is not the same thing as understanding what the problem is. And after you have understood what the problem is, then you try to strengthen the scientific mode, analyze it, structure it, and then take it forward. So, to undertake any of these sub steps, one has to secure and analyze the pertinent facts, which is what the slide had shown you. Let us go back to the slide, so that you are able to capture it. Remember, here I have said secure and analyze the pertinent facts. Decision making by and large has to be scientific, to be actionable, to be impact making, and to get somewhere so far as the problem is concerned. Therefore, decisions which are not based on facts do have the possibility of going right, but that is a huge risk. Risk is considerably mitigated if you have marshaled the facts. You develop alternatives of how to improve upon the situation, how to create a situation where you have no means of getting around it unless you are willing to live with it, and nobody wants to live with a problem. So, develop alternative solutions or courses of action, and then once you have developed alternative sources or courses of action, then each action has to be evaluated for its pros and cons. It has to be evaluated for its strengths and weaknesses, and in a tabular mode the best alternative has to be selected. This is how organizations operate. So, how many types of decisions can possibly there be? Really, it's the list can be as long as you would wish it to be, but for the purposes of our discussion here, I would like to identify a few generally accepted types of decisions. There are organizational decisions, decisions which touch the entire organization for one reason or another. There are personal decisions, decisions which touch an individual, which have an impact for the individual and which can go no further. Basic or non-programmed decisions, they are also a type of decision. These are decisions, but they have not been programmed. Then, as you can well imagine, just as there are basic and non-programmed decisions, there are routine and programmed decisions, and finally, there are group decisions. So, as I have already cautioned you, it is not as if this is an exhaustive list of decisions. So, let me show it to you, so that your recall on this is clear. The 5 decisions I talked about are listed here, but they are only illustrative and they go only so far. The techniques of decision making are really large. In fact, you can have a full course on techniques of decision making. It will not be possible for us to go through the entire list, but let me show to you certain illustrative techniques of decision making. It does not really matter if you are not familiar with each of them, or you are not able to note every single technique which I may be elaborating, but so long as you are aware that there are techniques of decision making, you will have a level of confidence in recognizing the fact that decision making itself is a very scientific process, and there are time tested ways of coming to a conclusion. The first example which comes to my mind of techniques of decision making is what is generally termed as SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis is an analysis of the strength, weakness, opportunities, threats of any situation. Evaluation by the decision making individual or organization of strength, weaknesses, opportunities and threats with respect to the desired achievement of objectives is SWOT analysis. For the present, I believe that is adequate. To move forward, some of the other techniques of decision making could be the analytic hierarchy process, which is a procedure for multiple level goal hierarchy. There is the buyer decision process, transactions before and after a purchase. There are decision trees, program evaluation and review techniques, popularly referred to as PERT. There are critical path techniques. There are critical chain analysis methods. There is the force field analysis. There is the grid analysis, and of course, it is possible you have heard of linear programming and the min max criteria, and the techniques just go on in a manner which would almost make it appear that there are endless techniques. The techniques may be endless, but their use and their efficacy is another matter. We have to select from the kit the techniques which works best for the problem we are trying to handle. Some of the other techniques of decision making would include modeling, that is theoretical constructs of economic processes of variables and their relationships. Modeling need not be only of economic processes, it can be of any activity, any action which has variables in a relationship under what can be called processes could lend itself to modeling. There is the Monte Carlo method, that is the class of computational algorithms for simulating systems. A good technique for making assumptions and looking at possibilities of the consequences, and then trying to generate n number of options, so that the ultimate choice is reason driven. There is morphological analysis, which looks at all possible solutions to multiple dimensional problems. There is constrained optimization. There is paired comparison analysis, which is essentially a paired comparison or choice analysis. Pareto analysis, selection of a limited number of tasks that produce significant overall effect. The list would also include scenario analysis, the 6 thinking hats, strategic planning process, ubiquitous command and control, and as I said, the list can go on. The ubiquitous command and control is a concept for dynamic decision making based on agreements between the individual and the world, as it were. It is also an agreement between individuals. It has to do with operations and selections of techniques to take matters forward. I would like at this stage to make a reference to styles and methods of decision making. I will pause here for a while, so that you are able to absorb the components. To go through it, there is the positional style, there is the combinational style. The positional style is a question of how you go about using the techniques. For the same technique, you could have a non-deterministic style, you could have a deterministic style. You could have a positional goal, and you could have a very narrow, clearly defined primarily material goal. You could have a formation of semi-complete linkages between initial steps and the final outcome, and you could have a program that links the initial position with the final outcome. Now, these clusters are decision styles using different kind of decision techniques. The purpose of walking you through this is very simply to cause awareness of the complexities of decision making, because management is all about decision making, as I alerted you right in the beginning. For some, positional style is better as compared to combinational, as it serves to create a predisposition to the future development of the position. It induces the environment in a certain way. It absorbs an unexpected outcome in one's favor. It avoids the negative aspects of unexpected outcomes. Most importantly, it avoids the negative aspects of unexpected outcomes. To cause that, therefore, one has to take certain steps which will mitigate the negative aspects, and that again makes operating organizations an art, where even while taking a decision which may prima facie be right, one has to be conscious that if there are negative fallouts, they have to be contained. There are twofold approaches to decision making, and a lot of work has gone behind it. Guren and Hirokawa had said years ago that functional theory to evaluate quality of group decision making is the best, whereas there are others like Putnam and Stoll and Holmes, who said that bona fide group studies in natural settings, preferably longitudinal, are what is required. Now, the distinction between a functional theory to evaluate quality of group decision making and bona fide group studies operate on two assumptions. So, decision making is a huge area of debate, elaboration, analysis. At this stage of your learning, suffice it to state and for you to absorb that there are complexities, and it is not as if decision making is a simple exercise of choices. But one question remains: if there are different approaches to decision making, and if there is the use of various decision tools in decision making and techniques, then how is this achieved? Planning, investigation, analysis, implementation and assessment are the handmaidens for this, and these handmaidens have to be taken together with various other theories of decision making. The selection is an art, the practice requires a scientific basis, and ultimately, like always in management, the art and the scientific basis together become the craft. According to the functional theory, groups must meet 5 functions during interaction. I will leave that again on the screen for a few moments, so that you are able to read it. Then I will try to walk you through it to explain what is the sum and substance which I wish you to register through this elaboration. Let us try to walk through this. Problem analysis requires understanding of the nature of the problem, the extent and seriousness of the problem, the likely causes of the problem, the possible consequences of not dealing effectively with the problem. All decision making begins with problem analysis. This is a relatively commonsensical approach, broken up into sub segments elaborated here: A, B, C, D, which moves on to the establishment of the evaluation criteria. A group must recognize the specific standards that the choices must satisfy. Now, this is a very important dimension to bring into decision making. Decision making is not just problem solving, which of course it is, but the decision must have a quality. It must satisfy that the goals have been achieved, and it must be acceptable by the evaluators of the decision, otherwise the decision will not be sustained. There is a generation of alternative solutions which is required. A group must generate or be aware of a number of appropriate or feasible alternative choices, among which an acceptable choice is assumed to exist. It gives the feeling, which is important for taking it forward, that all options were explored. If all options were not explored and a decision was taken before the actual decision was taken, then you have a problem. Hence, the need to be aware of appropriate and feasible alternative choices, all of which would have a certain level of acceptability. The evaluation of the positive consequences of the solution are important, because given the information available, a group needs to be fully cognizant of the relative merits of all available alternatives, and this links up with the immediate preceding thought. Just as you look at the positive consequences of a decision, you need to recognize the negative consequences of a decision, and therefore, be conscious that the negative consequences of a decision, which will very often be there, cannot outweigh the positive outcome of a decision. Hence, there is a need for being bona fide in group perspective. Two characteristics that underline a bona fide group, or what can be called permeable and fluid boundaries and interdependence with the context. The idea of groupness itself and the social process that form and sustain a group, because both of these rest on continuous negotiation of borders, boundaries and arenas, and here decision making becomes an art. One has to be conscious of the continual negotiation of boundaries, borders and arenas, because they keep changing. Within that, groupness itself and the social process has to bring about a bona fide group perspective, because everyone who is affected needs to be a party to this. There are various views of people which will be elaborated and they will be discussed, but before we get into this, any decision making, any problem solving, any need to operate an organization lies in three things. First, the organization itself must create a feeling of a considered response to a given situation or a demand or a pressure on it. It cannot be ad hoc, it cannot be casual, it cannot be erratic, it cannot be predetermined. The second is that any organization, when in the mode of decision making, will have to do it with resource optimization, because any wastage of resources is not the way forward. In an era of human civilization, where resource management is one of the keys to the sustainability of civilization itself, this is a still more heightened need. It has always been a need, but resource optimization is perhaps more valid a concern today than it has ever been in the past. The third concern has to do with the fallouts of decision making, and the fallouts of decision making have to do with its impact on organizational renewal, organizational vitality, and to what extent is the organization gaining from the decision itself. Is it revitalizing itself? Because all organizations undergo the metabolic process, that is the interplay of anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is the process of destruction of the cells. Catabolism is the process of renewal of those cells. So, anabolism and catabolism together are the essence of the metabolic process. This is how a human body is kept alive. We have drawn the analogy of the human body in understanding structures. We have drawn the analogy of the human body in understanding processes. I am drawing once again the analogy of the human body in understanding decision making consequences, and saying that whatever does not strengthen the metabolic process of an organization, or those processes of the organization which have to do with the renewal of the organization, which have to do with the sustenance of the organization, which have to do with the survival of the organization and its coping strategies, to meet the challenges to which it does and will forever be affected, is also an important touchstone of decision making.